Krishna. You hear me?
Yater, yeah, I can hear you.
I just sent an email out to all the members in the club, so we'll see what happens. But
Yeah. We're going to start in another 2 minutes, and then Dr. Turner is going to present for the next hour, and then we have a 30-minute Q&A at the end, okay?
perfect. Perfect. All right, I'm running in to get some food real quick, so I'm gonna mute myself. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
And Krishna, I have to be back on campus, so I'm going to probably sneak out during the Q&A. I just didn't want to leave without letting you know.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Vogel. So, Dr. Turner, just so you are aware, Professor Judith Vogel is a mathematics professor at Stockton University. She is our faculty advisor for the Science of Life Club.
Okay, nice
And
to meet you.
And Yater Henry is a undergrad pre-med student studying psychology. He's the president of our club.
Okay.
Dr. Kamala, namaste. Thank you for coming. She's a cancer researcher based in Boston, based in Philadelphia.
Oh,
So I'll start with an introduction of Dr. Turner. He is a heterodox biologist who is a retired professor from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and currently he serves as the Director of Science Programs at the National Association of Scholars. His latest book is Purpose and Desire, published in 2017. Dr. Turner's presentation today will concern one, purposiveness in biology, and two, the need for academic and intellectual freedom in the academy and universities. As I stated earlier, Dr. Turner's presentation will go until 4:30, and then from 4:30 until 5 o'clock, we have a Q&A. So without further ado, Dr. Turner, thank you again.
well, thank you very much for having me. This is a great honor to be able to come and present to you. As Christian has said, I'm a heterodox biologist, physiologist, and that's led me to some rather interesting places intellectually. So I have a slideshow. Let me just get that started and share the screen here. Okay, well, as one of the strange places that I've been led to is with the issue of purpose in life and in the science of biology. And just want to advance this. Am I going to be able to do this? I'm sorry. This is always a complicated issue. There we are. Okay, there we are. And Krishna has already given me a very nice introduction. Thank you for that. Purpose and desire is probably the place where I've had to confront the issue of purposeful life, I guess I would say. But that's the third book in a series of other books that is sort of an outline of my journey from being a fairly conventional biologist, physiologist to where I am right now intellectually. And if I had to point to one question that's animated most of my career, it's this one here. What does the science of life have to say about how life evolves? And we'll be getting into some of those issues as we go along. But let's start with the what the kind of conventional viewpoint of what purpose plays in the science of life. And I started off the book Purpose and Desire with quotes from four very prominent evolutionary biologists, and they had some rather pointed things to say about whether purpose has any place in the science of life. And first off the bat is Will Provine. He's deceased now, but he was a philosopher of biology out of Cornell University. And here is his opinion on this. There are no gods, no purpose, no goal-directed forces of any kind. There's no ultimate foundation for ethics or ultimate meaning to life, and no free will for humans either. Francis Crick, of course, is famous for, along with James Watson, working out the structure of DNA in the 1950s. And here's what he has to say on it. Science has shown you that your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have put it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. I think we all know who Richard Dawkins is, a very gifted writer and commenter on evolutionary biology. And here's what he has to say. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And then Daniel Dennett, who is a straight up philosopher, he wrote Darwin's Dangerous Idea. He has this to say: no matter how impressive the products of an algorithm are, and in this sense, the algorithm is natural selection, the underlying process always consists of nothing but a series of individually mindless steps succeeding each other without the help of any intelligent supervision. Okay, so that sounds like a pretty bleak outlook, not only on life, but also on the prospects of having a science of purposeful life, purposeful biology. And if it's true, well, as I say, that doesn't bode well for that. But I think that it is untrue. All those statements don't really add up to a coherent viewpoint. And they arrive at this point. In fact, the science of life has arrived at this point because the science of life is permeated with a series of misapprehensions about what life is, how it works, and so forth. So we're just going to go through the misapprehensions as I've outlined them. This is going to be fairly straightforward and quick, just to give you an idea of the landscape of what a purposeful science of life would look like. And so the first misapprehension, it seems like a linguistic issue. Organism is a noun. That seems like a fairly uncontroversial idea. That is, organisms are objects that exist in space and time and so forth. But in fact, organism is more of a verb than a noun. It's an action. And if you look at the physiology of living things, and here's a little cartoon of it, you have a flow of matter through the organism. Free energy is used to organize that matter into the form, of this wolf. And ultimately, it's a unstable system, and it ultimately all degrades to heat. Okay, so that's the basic look at this. And what this means is that the organism is not a thing. It's a process. You have this continual flow of matter and energy through the organism. What the organism is basically is an ephemeral assemblage of disorderly matter that is in the atmosphere: carbon dioxide, oxygen, water, and those kinds of things, proteins, amino acids. And this is all organized to produce the form of an organism. And thermodynamically, this is a very complex form. It's very low entropy. It's very specified low entropy. And because of this, it's an unstable entity. So the organism, the orderly form of the organism, is always degrading to disorderliness. And then what happens is that the organism mobilizes a flow of energy, flow of matter, I beg your pardon, and uses free energy to organize that into the form of this wolf right here. And so literally, if if you see a friend and you run into him a year later, you are literally not talking to the same person. nearly all the matter in the person's body has actually changed over time. And so this is a continuous process. And when we think about organisms, we have to think about them as verbs. Now, what we can do is we can now take that concept and we can abstract it, if you will. This is an abstraction of what we just saw. It's inside the organism. It's a very low entropy system, high entropy outside, and you have free energy, which is the metabolic rate, really, that is brought into the system. That system takes disorderly matter from outside and organizes it into orderly matter. And in both cases, you still have this second law of thermodynamics that ultimately degrades the thing to heat. And important here is this concept of an adaptive boundary. This doesn't happen by magic. There are structures and functions within the body that actually do that. I called it an adaptive boundary because it's a boundary between the environment, if you will, and outside the organism and the environment within the organism. And we'll be coming back to the adaptive boundary quite a bit as we move on. Among other things, this leads us into the second misapprehension, which is that the living organism is something that exists in a non-physical world. That is, what's inside the body is alive, and what's outside the body is not alive. And that is a concept that doesn't really stand up very well either. Here we come back to this concept of an adaptive boundary, and I've framed this in terms of, say, a cell membrane, for example. And so there's an internal environment over here, which could be construed as the inside of the cell, and an external environment, which could be construed as everything outside the cell. This is obviously living, we know this, but it's a mistake to say that this part is not living. And so what we have here is we have a boundary. You can have engines within the boundary, for example, that take free energy and do work. And these power what we're calling a physiological flux of matter into the body, into this environment over here. And at the same time, excuse me, this is a low entropy system. There's a gradient of entropy, and this is going to power a second law of thermodynamics mediated flux that we're calling the dynamically favored flux. All right, so this balance of order versus disorder, this is really a balance between the physiological flux, which does work to produce order. At the same rate, you're losing order through this thermodynamically favorable flux. Okay, and all this is managed by an adaptive boundary. All right. An example of that is the cell, for example. And, this is a cartoon of a cell with a membrane. It has embedded in the membrane ATPases that take free energy in the form of ATP and do work with it. In the case of salt and water balance, this mediates an active transport of potassium from outside the cell into it, and at the same time a work-driven flux of sodium from inside the cell to outside. And depending upon what the external environment is, that could affect these fluxes right over through here. So you're going to have a flux of potassium out, a flux of sodium in. Water can flow across here through membrane-bound aquaporins and so forth. And when you frame it in this way, and this is simply derived from the conservation of mass principle, if you take potassium from outside the cell and you move it into the cell, you're increasing potassium concentration here, but you're also decreasing it out here in the external environment. And of course, the inverse is true for sodium. And so this means that everything that's going on inside the cell, the physiology of the cell, is necessarily imparted to what's going on outside the cell as well. So it's a fallacy to say that physiology only occurs within an adaptive boundary. Life only occurs within an adaptive boundary. If this living process is operating you're imparting life actually to the external environment. It's not always easy to see, but nevertheless, that's what the conservation of mass principle says. These adaptive boundaries, I indicated the simplest one, probably the most fundamental one, because living things are all made up of cells. The cell membrane is probably the ultimate adaptive boundary, but there's nothing that says that these adaptive boundaries can't nest. And so, in the previous example, you consider this the internal intracellular environment, for example. This was the extracellular environment. But if you build a new adaptive boundary outside that, then this has become an internalized external environment, if you will. External with respect to this, but internalized by this adaptive boundary. And what this does is it takes the things that can disrupt the physiology going on outside the cell if it's forced strongly by random variations in the external environment. And what this organization does is it helps damp these fluctuations so that you can get a nice, steady, stable environment within the cell. All right. And there's some lots of examples about of this. I outline many of them in the extended organism, for example. One of my favorite examples is earthworms. Most people think of earthworms as living in a terrestrial environment. Physiologically, they're actually aquatic annelids, and they have the kidneys and water balance organs appropriate for an aquatic annelid. And yet they manage to live in a terrestrial environment. And this notion of nested adaptive boundaries is one of the reasons why it's able to do that. So, for example, if you have the cells living in an extracellular fluid, the water balance organs of the earthworm or the nephridia, these are a system of tubules that are encased by an epithelium, which are basically just cells that have organized into sheet-like structures. And this can help them survive in environments that they're physiologically not suited to live in. And you can carry this on. Here's the extracellular fluid right there. There are the cells. These nephridial tubules are structured in a certain way. These drain into and they filter they manage fluxes of mass and energy across their epithelia. These combine into the nephridial bladder, for example, and then that all vents to the outside. Now, the interesting thing about extended physiology, that is physiology that is imparted to the external environment by the presence of a living thing, is that the reason earthworms can survive, these aquatic annelids can survive in soil environments, is that they actually impart living attributes to the soil environment in which they live. We all know about how they make tunnels, they chew up mulch, all that kind of thing, all that kind of stuff. What that does is, of course, helps retain water in the soil. It moderates the temperature of the soil and so forth. And basically, what they're doing is these earthworms are creating a kind of semi-aquatic habitat in the soil that enables them to survive in there, even though they're physiologically not capable of doing it, not capable as earthworms, period. And so the bottom line here is that when you're talking about the presence of life in an environment, it's impossible. And again, this comes just from the conservation of mass principle, that life is basically a conspiracy of environments, things that are enclosed within adaptive boundaries, also modifications to the external environment that the organisms might bring about. And so what we say here is that, well, there's really a conspiracy of environments going on here, and the conspirators, if you will, discuss across the adaptive boundary. That's what these are. And okay, as I've said, this makes physiology an extensive property of life. That is, it is something that extends beyond the boundaries that are imposed upon it. And this means that organisms are extended phenomena. That's the whole point of the extended organism. And the kind of, I think, radical idea, if you will, is that this means that there's no such thing as a division between living systems, internal systems, and and a non-living external environment. If you have life there, it's going to impart life to its environment. And this can extend uh, uh, really to the ultimate limits of the biosphere. Uh, we've all heard the theory of Gaia, for example. Gaia is the notion that life is well, that the Earth is a single organism, if you will. That's been a controversial idea among many of my more conventionally minded colleagues. They think this is absolute rubbish, but to me, as a physiologist, and for this reason right here, Gaia is something that makes perfect sense to me. And the principal evidence of this, of course, as James Lovelock has said, is the fact that the atmosphere is a biologically constructed entity. You would not have an oxygen rich atmosphere and so forth without the presence of living things that help make it. Okay, so going on to the third misapprehension. Homeostasis, will have a lot of things to say about this. Homeostasis is usually thought of as a kind of regulatory system. There's machinery involved and so forth. But this is really kind of a misapprehension, another misapprehension. And homeostasis was the person who's most famous for this concept is this man, Claude Bernard. He was a French physiologist. He was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. He's often described as the father of experimental medicine. It's an apt sobriquet, if you will. And he he formulated this notion of homeostasis as a kind of summation of all of his work. He was a very skilled experimentalist. He was very influenced by the chemistry of life and so forth. So, a lot of people tend to think that Bernard was a very strict materialist, but actually, as we'll see, he wasn't. Now, Claude Bernard is usually introduced to people in physiology books and biology books through a very famous aphorism. Obviously, he was French and he wrote in French, and therefore his writings are a little bit inaccessible. But his famous aphorism is this, and he said that the steadiness of the internal environment is the condition for a free and independent life. And the structure of this sentence is very important. Steadiness of the internal environment is the predicate, if you will, for the free and independent life. Now, because Bernard is regarded as a very strict materialist today, he focused on how the internal environment is regulated, the mechanisms behind that. And so, regulation of body temperature, regulation of water balance, metabolic regulation, and those kinds of things. And as I said, he was a very meticulous, careful experimentalist. He is famous for working out some of the chemical signals, if you will, or interactions between different systems in the body that went to producing this steadiness of the internal environment. Now, homeostasis is one of those things that we all know what it is. There's a very good definition for it, for example, in every physiology textbook. But homeostasis is actually a far more profound concept than that. And it makes it what I would regard as probably the most thoroughly misunderstood and trivialized concept in modern biology. And let me just describe why I think that. Now, homeostasis has made its way as a concept into the 20th century. The word homeostasis was actually coined in a book called The Wisdom of the Body by a physiologist, Walter B. Cannon. He's the one who actually coined the word homeostasis. And Cannon was very much in the same mindset that Bernard was. But the modern concept of homeostasis was shaped in large part by this man, Norbert Wiener. He was an engineer, a very philosophically interesting man. He was a pioneer in control systems and computer engineering. And Wiener was a very great admirer of Claude Bernard's work because he had laid out the terms for organisms as self-regulating entities. You didn't have to have some kind of external thing controlling them; they did it themselves. And one of the things that Wiener wanted to do was to mimic homeostasis in machines by building regulatory machines. And this concept of homeostasis as cybernetics, if you will, is very much akin to how we tend to think about homeostasis today. And we'll go through some critiques of that, but let's just outline briefly what the cybernetics of regulation might be. Now, one of Bernard's not Bernard's, I beg your pardon, Wiener's inventions was to say that, well, you can have regulation of a property by having a system of machines that can be assembled together in what he called a negative feedback controller. And the thermostat on the wall of your house is an example of that. So if you have a state that's perturbed, for example, house gets too cold, house gets too hot, whatever, and you compare that to some desired state, if you will, and this desire comes in you setting the number on the thermostat, then this activates work through an effector to oppose the perturbation. And so if you follow the temperature of a room, for example, over through time, you'll see it'll oscillate between upper and lower limits, but it'll be maintained within the range that's set by the sensitivity of the sensor of the actual state, what the desired state should be, what the difference between the two should be, and then work that's done to actually basically reduce the perturbation of the state from its desired state. Okay, so that's the fundamental concept of negative feedback control. And it didn't take long for physiologists to pick up on this. Wiener was active prior to World War II, for example, and for many years, there was a quest among physiologists to find the elements of a negative feedback control system within the body. And for a time, they looked like they were doing pretty well. And this is the model that was kind of popular back in the 1970s and so forth. And it has all the elements of a negative feedback controller. You have some kind of a set temperature. You have sensors that can sense the temperature of the system, if you will. If it's too cold, then you'll get busy activating heat gain effectors, and this can include things like generation of heat, how thick the fur is, blood flow to the skin, evaporation from the lungs and skin, and so forth. And if it gets too warm, then you can activate heat loss effectors. And the idea was that, okay, well, if you take all these things together, you'll have basically the elements of the cybernetic regulation of body temperature. And there were even some really interesting things that were done back in that time. So, for example, fever has long been regarded as some kind of out of control, or was long regarded as some kind of out of control temperature, but in fact, it's actually a very tightly controlled state. So when you have fever, basically you're doing the same thing as turning the thermostat up, if you will. And the same thing for body temperature regulation for hibernation of mammals. So things were looking pretty promising for a long time, and this was kind of the rage for working out the physiology of homeostasis. And again, I would just point out that this is a cybernetic form of homeostasis. Now that was fine, except as in all kinds of things, there are complications, there's deviations between actual experimental results and theoretical expectations. One of the things that has happened in this field is you have basically a proliferation of what I'm calling dash stats, so you might have hypothalamic receptors, for example, skin receptors for temperature, multiple integrating centers And you can see some of the elements of this of trying to build a cybernetic machine that regulates body temperature. But okay, here we have two, but there are many aspect areas of the body that can feed temperature information in, and that can regulate their own body temperatures, so, or the temperatures of themselves. And so, for example, it was thought that the thermostat was in the hypothalamus of the brain, and then it was discovered that, well, skin sensors for temperature can actually influence that as well. And the heart can regulate its own temperature to a degree. And the problem there was that there's no apparent granularity limit in that quest. Uh, Basically, where things came to is that every cell in the body can act as its own thermostat. Okay, and all right, so where's this wonderful negative feedback machine in that case? It's also the case that there's some interesting results from lizards, for example, that don't regulate that don't have high body temperatures. They regulate their body temperature, though. But if you look at the ecology of lizards and how they thermoregulate, for example, it's clear that this kind of model just doesn't work. What you have there is, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but lizards go around and they assess the risk of predation in their environment, and then their temperature regulation is adjusted compared to that. And as I say, I don't want to get too much into the weeds here. But this means that, okay, well, it's not a machine that's operating here to regulate temperature. It's actually a reflection of a cognitive state of the lizard itself, right? It's assessing the environment, lots of different aspects of the environment, and then adjusting its behavior appropriately. And then there's the really interesting issue, which is that if you look at swarms of insects, for example, social insect colonies like honeybees, if you stick thermocouples or temperature sensors into the middle of a honeybee swarm, for example, or in a honeybee hive, it regulates its temperature. And so, where's the thermostat there? Where's the cybernetic system there? And so the cybernetic model of homeostasis actually starts to break down the deeper into life you get. And this leads us into the fourth misapprehension. Um, if you say the word vitalism to a biologist, that person will react very badly. All right. If you're a vitalist, you're not a scientist, is the basic reaction. And so I I like to call vitalism the V word, something that distinguishes real science, this is in quotes, from fake science. And if you're a vitalist, you're not a scientist. To be a scientist, you can't be a vitalist, and that's doesn't really ring true. I mentioned that Claude Bernard has been handed down to us in history as a very strict materialist because he actually worked out the chemistry and interactions of how you get the steadiness of the internal environment. But if you delve a bit more deeply into Bernard's philosophy, it's it becomes ever more clear that he was a vitalist of some sort. He's what I like to call a small V vitalist. A big V vitalist would be someone who believes in vital essences or vital forces, things that you can't really get a handle on. But small V vitalism, which is what Bernard did, he just said that, well, okay, here's a living thing, all right, and it's distinctive somehow in some fundamental way from everything else in the universe. So life is a distinctive phenomenon and it's different. And that's basically the vitalist philosophy. It's been that way for centuries. However, he did not think about vitalism as the action of vital essences or ineffable vital forces or so forth. What he said was that, well, life is actually distinguished not by those from inanimate matter, just by those things, but by the nature of the processes that operate within living systems. And so He could work comfortably in chemistry because life is of chemistry. Living things live in a physical world, all right? But it's not only chemistry. There's something else that distinguishes life from non-life. And the most interesting aspect of this small v vitalist outlook on Bernard's thinking is that he actually inverts the relationship of cause and effect radically from where the cybernetic conception of homeostasis does. And so in the cybernetic conception, you have a cybernetic machine, a negative feedback controller, or what have you, and its operation produces a steadiness of a property. That's homeostasis. And in this instance, the cybernetic machine is the cause of the effect, homeostasis. However, if you take a small v vitalist approach to this, and this was closer to what Bernard's idea was, it actually inverts the relationship between cause and effect. And Bernard regarded homeostasis, this steadiness of the internal environment, as a fundamental property of life. And when it's fundamental, it's not derivable from everything else. And so homeostasis is the cause, and the effect is the mechanism, right? Whereas in the cybernetic conception, this was the cause and this was the effect. In the Bernardian conception, it's just the opposite. And this is a little bit difficult to get your head around because it means that all living mechanisms, including the formation of negative feedback machines, are a consequence of this fundamental property right here. And this little scribble in Greek letters right here, the bios, we'll come back to that momentarily, but just tuck that back in your mind a little bit, and we'll come back to it because it leads us to the next misapprehension, and that is that organisms adapt to environments. And this is a very prominent way of thinking in modern biology. Uh, it's that if you have an organism out there, this is especially true in doctrines of natural selection, that organisms adapt to environments. That is, an organism is plunked down in an environment, and the environment is what it is, and the organism either survives or doesn't. And if the organism survives, it's adapted to the environment. If an organism doesn't survive in that environment, well, they're not adapted to the environment. And so this is part of the notion that what contradicts this is what I've just outlined, which is that living things actually impart life to their external environments, and this complicates the nature of adaptation considerably. And I'd like to just illustrate this with a simple example. I spent quite a bit of time in Namibia, the country of Namibia, in southern Africa for my work, and there's lots of fascinating creatures there, plants as well. And one of the more fascinating is this creature right here. It's called Welwitschia mirabilis, and it sits in the hyper-arid Namib. It's actually the state plant of Namibia, and uh, if you look at this, this is kind of a strange idea that it's there because Welwitschia is not a desert plant. It lives in a hyper arid environment, very sunny, very hot, but it doesn't have any of the normal adaptations that desert plants do. And how is it that they survive there? And the answer is that these very large leaves, which run contrary to everything we think we know about adaptation of plants to hot, dry conditions, they actually create a microenvironment, if you will, in their shade, and this has some pretty important implications for adaptation. And so, for example, we did a very simple experiment. We don't need to get into a lot of the details, but we basically measured temperature differences of soil in the open environment as the sun cycled through the sky, and compared that to the variations of soil temperature underneath the leaves of these environments. And this is a plot that's it's called the Lissajous plot. You can see that there's a very radical difference between what's going on here. So the fluctuations of temperature are much greater here than they are in this blue squiggle right here, which is, of course, what's underneath the leaves. And let's have a look at what that means physiologically. When you have temperatures in this area right here, that means that heat is being forced into the ground. And when you have temperatures in this region right there, it means that heat is coming up from the ground. So it's a way of looking at the pumping of heat into soils. And the implication is obvious. You know, the soil in the without the shade, you get a much greater degree of heat pumping through the soil during the course of the day, and this is going to drive not only extremes of temperature, but also any water that happens to be stored in the soil. But if you look at what's going on under the leaves in the shade, this is a very different microenvironment, and you don't have as much heat pumping. That means it retains moisture better, and this is one of the thing. The environment is cooler, and this is one of the things that enables these non-desert plants to survive in desert conditions. That's quite remarkable. So, the Welwitschia is actually creating an environment that's suitable to itself. All right. It's not only adapting to the environment of the Namib, it's actually adapting the environment to itself. And so this means that adaptation is really kind of a two-way street. It's among the examples of this extended organism idea. And this leads us then to the next misapprehension, and it's what I call the anatomical fallacy. And no doubt, everyone who's taken biology has been exposed to this. For example, the first thing you do when you talk about anatomy and physiology is you immediately dissect the organism into a bunch of systems. And the lung, for example, is one of those systems. And the lung's function is respiratory gas exchange, right? That's what you're told. And then they go on to the next chapter about the endocrine system. And of course, there's several different endocrine glands there, ductless glands that secrete hormones into the blood that regulate function through some kind of negative feedback system, like the regulation of blood sugar, for example. Okay, nice and neat partition between the respiratory system and the endocrine system. But, then if you delve a little bit deeper, the lungs are also endocrine glands, right? They secrete hormones, and so where's the division into these different anatomical systems? You can't sustain them. The more you get into it, the more it becomes clear that the living system is an integrated system. Many systems have multiple functions and so forth, and so you can't really understand living systems if if you subscribe to the anatomical fallacy. In looking at homeostasis from the cybernetic point of view, for example, and this is an example of what I spoke about, if you look at the regulation of temperature, for example, in mammals, you can divide this into multiple regulatory systems. And again, what you're doing here is like the anatomical fallacy atomizes the organism into different anatomical systems. This does this for regulation as well. And so what you've done is you've taken the regulation of a single property, temperature, and you've atomized its regulation into multiple different systems, if you will. And so again, we come back to this atomization of adaptation as a form of this anatomical fallacy. And this becomes, well, the anatomical fallacy extends. These are the creatures that I actually worked on. This is a plaster cast of the inside of a termite mound. This is a southern African termite. They're noted for building these large soil mounds. The nest, actually, where the termites live, is located deep underground below the mound. And the mound itself is permeated with this incredible network of tunnels that vary in size and so forth. And what this is a wind-driven lung, if you will, all right? But like the lung, it does other things as well. The termites build this from by transporting soil up into the mound. That's how the mound is built. The mound, once it's built, it captures wind energy in the turbulent wind, and what this does is it actually facilitates gas exchange between the nest down here and the atmosphere over here. It does exactly what our own lungs do, for example, and remarkably, the mechanism of action is very similar to how our own lungs work. But again, I want to pose the question: what are the parts here? How do you dissect this into mound versus termites versus nest? And the answer is that you can't. They're so strongly intertwined with one another that they behave as if they were a single organism. Okay, and then the seventh misapprehension, which is the last one, is that uh, just like the idea is that if you have any taint of vitalism in you, you cannot be a scientist. A corollary of that is that to do science, you need to be a reductionist. That is, you need to sort out your things at the uttermost complicated level of function. And molecular biology, for example, is the ultimate reductionist approach to life. You're trying to get down and get into the uttermost molecular details of how life works. And the cybernetic conception of homeostasis is an example of that. And here's a reprise of that diagram that I showed you a little bit earlier. Uh, and you can formulate models for how homeostasis works. For example, you can say that, all right, well, there's some kind of a cognitive engine in there somewhere that's going to assess the state of the internal environment versus external environment, make a comparison, communicate that information, and control something that actually does work. That's part of what I'm calling an orderliness engine here that can both reduce entropy and can produce entropy. And this is the balance between physiological and thermodynamically favored fluxes. But if we build this cybernetic conception, we ultimately come to the question, well, all right, what's the set point for an organism? What is the nature of the self-knowledge that an organism has of where it should be, where the system should tend towards? All right. Uh, you can't get away with just sensors that are involved here. You have to have some means of comparing the output of these sensors to some form of self-knowledge of what the organism wants to be, and wants is a loaded term there. And here we come back to this idea of the bios. So here's where we're going to come back to that. Now, this is tied into the validity of vitalism as a scientific concept. And if you look at the history of Western philosophy, for example, and a lot of this can apply to other types of philosophical structures as well. Uh, Back at the time of the Socratics, there were three different philosophical schools of thought that were thought to explain nature. And one, of course, was the atomistic thought of Democritus, for example. And this is the ultimate reductionist approach to the nature of nature of life, and so forth. But in contrast to this, two major schools of thought were, of course, Platonism, who was a student of Socrates, as we know, and Aristotelianism, and Aristotle, of course, was a student of Plato. And these are grouped into what I call the two purposeful philosophies of life. And it builds purpose into this the into life in a particular way that atomism doesn't. And over time, you've had different fortunes. For example, with the origin of the atomic theory of matter, for example, uh, atomism got to be very popular and so forth. In the case of the biology, though, um, a lot of biology, a lot of biological science has actually set rather comfortably within these two purposeful philosophies. So it's simply not true to say that in order to be a good scientist, biological scientist, you have to be in this school right here, over here, the atomistic school. Biology has been a very rich area of inquiry, and a lot of that area of inquiry has sat in these purposeful philosophies. Now, I mentioned process vitalism a little while ago with respect to Claude Bernard. He was a process vitalist, and that was originated by this man here. He was a French physician. He was on the faculty of medicine at Montpellier University, and he was the originator of process vitalism. And the basic problem with process vitalism, I should say, the basic problem that process vitalism addressed was the failure of essentialist vitalism, the idea that life was imparted to matter by these ineffable vital essences or vital forces. And that didn't make a lot of sense to not Bernard, I'm sorry, Bourdieu. And he had a very interesting insight that involved the honeybee swarm. He looked at the honeybee swarm and he said that, well, these things have a lot of behavior like organisms have, like the individual bees have in this swarm. And yet, how can you have vital essences in such a thing? How is it that you can get organism-like behavior here when vital essences could not possibly work? And nevertheless, you got the same behavior. And his conception was that what made this distinctively alive was the processes that were involved in there. And he had a concept called the many little lives. And he said that the organism like behavior here comes from a process of endless negotiation and mutual accommodation of the many little lives of the swarm. And the same thing applies to what goes on within the body as well. And this is where things start to become very interesting because uh, this concept of the bios, this was formulated by Aristotle. This was one of his signature ideas here. And the bios is a kind of ideal state, if you will, towards which the organism, that is, the organism strives. And this means that the organism, oops, I beg your pardon, let's go back, that the organism is actually striving to become this ideal form. And the material form of the organism can vary. If it gets cold, it could develop thicker plumage and these kinds of things. But always it's going to strive towards this ideal of the bios. It's a self-knowledge of what the organism intends to be. And intends is, again, a deliberate term. And the comparison I often like to make is between what I call the cumulus cloud and the cauliflower. Both are white and puffy. They both are the results of energetic processes. There's even forms of hereditary memory for both of them. But this is not alive, and this is alive. And what distinguishes it is that the cloud cannot possibly want to be a cloud, right? There's no striving there. But with the concept of the bios, you can credibly argue that the cauliflower, in some deep sense, wants to be a cauliflower. And so this leads us to my final conclusion is that much of biology, modern biology, has been governed by a program that I call the abolition of purpose. You saw an example of that in the four quotes that I gave you at the very beginning. And this takes on a kind of a new life because Bernard's homeostasis, properly understood, is actually a very close philosophical cousin to this Aristotelian bios, and you can't escape purposefulness in that, and so this makes purposefulness biology's inescapable reality. And much of modern biology has been devoted to escaping that inescapable concept. And so, for example, the organism, for example, it's a phenomenon of homeostasis, which is inherently purposeful. If you look at issues like biological design, why are organisms seemingly well structured to do the things that they do? The same thing is operating there. Design is actually an expression of homeostasis, and that makes design a purposeful phenomenon as well. And most controversially, it means that evolution itself is a frankly purposeful phenomenon. And I've made, I've part of my journey has involved going from being a fairly strong Darwinist in the early parts of my career, and eventually I came to the conclusion that no, I cannot be a Darwinist anymore because Darwinism is one of these aspects of the abolition of purpose. And you can come up with a scientifically credible way of working purpose back into biology, and that's where things end up there. All right, and so that's it. I will say thank you for that. But what I would like to do right now, Krishna asked me to. I'm going to see if I can share my screen again. Can I share my screen? Asked me to speak about. Okay, I'm not getting my. Not getting my. Trying to find the little thing that says I can share my screen. Okay, well, let's see here. Maybe I can stop sharing perhaps. Stop sharing. There we are. Okay, we're back. All right. So what I'd like to do is to share with you. Let's see here. This screen right here, and I want to. Oops, I beg your pardon. We're almost to 4 o'clock, I think. Oh, well, yeah, we still have 2 minutes. Okay. I'm still trying to work my way there. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, let's try this again. Krishna asked me to share with you something that struck him on my personal website. Here it is. It's jscottturner.com. If you want to find out more about me and what I do with my life, you can come there. And he was especially intrigued by this statement right here, which is that I've lately come to the conclusion that the battle for intellectual freedom in the universities has largely been lost. And so that's where that stands right there. All right, now I just want to go back to I think you can see that now, right? Is that what we're seeing?
Yes, we can see my perspective. I'm a basic scientist.
Wonderful. Okay. Now, I'm a basic scientist. I've been motivated by basically curiosity, and I went into academic science because I thought it promised me the intellectual freedom that I needed to pursue that curiosity, and that's come out in a number of different forms. So, for example, early in my career, I was interested in the physiology of thermoregulation in reptiles, and that's a 5-foot alligator that was one of our academic subjects. For a time, I was very interested in the biophysics of incubation of birds' eggs through brood patches, and there's more to that than the mommy bird sitting on the egg. There's actually some very interesting interactions between physiology and physics there. And then I mentioned that I've spent a good part of my career working on these creatures. That you've seen this diagram of of an endocast of what goes on inside the mound compared to what you see outside here. These are two of my students here standing outside a termite mound in Namibia, and working out how it is that these things manage to behave as a dirt lung, so to speak. And I've always defended this by saying that, well, I don't need it to be useful to anything. I wasn't looking for any product. I was just motivated by curiosity. There are some things that have come out of it. So, for example, we understand more about how the blood circulation moves heat around the body. The bird's egg work has actually prompted some new designs for artificial incubators, and in the case of termite mounds, there's some interesting implications there for incorporating wind power into ventilation of buildings. But I never did any of that. All right, that was always someone else's operation. I've collaborated with some of them quite closely, but nevertheless, I did basic science, and then that was what I did. And I did it because I had the intellectual freedom to do so. And this is why academic freedom and the freedom to pursue inquiry is so important, and why the university has become the natural, or should be the natural venue for science. And I'm just going to end this presentation and stop the sharing here, stop the sharing, and come back to myself. W- w- One of the things that I've noticed that I saw unfolding during my research career, which spanned about 30 years in academia, is how that freedom to pursue curiosity has been eroded. When I first arrived in my faculty position, I wasn't told, you can't study this. To I was never told that, and so I had the freedom then. And gradually over the years, it ended up with, well, no, you have to apply for grants, right? And I had grants. I did so. I had enough to be able to fund my research, but my needs were always modest, and I faced increasing pressure that, no, you have to apply for more and more grants. You have to do things that are useful, that result in products. And processes or something like that. Just discovering things was not so important anymore. And I spent a lot of time reflecting on this. This is related to my work with the National Association of Scholars. The real problem there is that the universities have become captured by an enormous stream of federal research money. There's about $100 billion of that flows into the universities each year. For scientific research. Not all of that goes to support scientific research. About a third of it goes to support growth of administrations, increasing the power of political entities like the federal government. It's appropriately political, that's what it is, on science. And what that's done, I think, has basically crushed the spirit of curiosity to, the spirit of academic freedom to follow curiosity. And the universities, I think, are in kind of bad shape right now because they've been captured by this enormous stream of money. And some of the work I'm doing with the National Association of Scholars is just how do we work our way out of this? And that's with that, I will stop and say thank you for your attention and open the floor to questions. We still have nearly a half an hour.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Turner. So please feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions that you might have, or if you feel more comfortable putting a message in the chat. This is a great opportunity to air out doubts, perhaps, that we have, or inquire for elaboration on anything Dr. Turner has discussed. If there are any challenges to something that was said. It's a safe space for open dialogue. Maybe I'll start with a question.
Okay.
So, when you were talking about the NVIDIA desert plant in your misapprehension slide 5, it seemed to me that this is niche construction.
It is. Mhm.
And so obviously niche construction is one of contemporary ideas that challenges traditional notions of natural selection driving evolution because, as you mentioned and showed very wonderfully, the environment doesn't just influence the organism, but the organism reciprocally influences the environment. So I was wondering if you could talk more about the extended organism as those termite mounds and niche construction. Is it simply two different ways of describing the same thing? Are there some nuances there that
Yes and yes. There's a kind of an interesting history there. Niche construction theory, and I'm good friends with the people who've have formulated that idea. Um, Niche construction theory began as a as a revision of standard models of population genetics to incorporate the fitness effects of organisms modifying environments. And this was derived from Richard Dawkins' extended phenotype idea, his book, The Extended Phenotype. And even though I'm kind of critical of some of the things that Richard Dawkins has said, I don't want to take anything away from the actual ingenuity and interesting things that he has had to say about biology. And to me, one of the most interesting has been his extended phenotype idea. And my work was in part inspired by Dawkins' extended phenotype idea, and so was the population genetics models that were coming out of niche construction theory. And so I was working along one line of inquiry, which was physiology, and they were working along another line of inquiry, which was population genetics and incorporating fitness consequences of environmental modification. And we ended up converging in the same place, of all things, and so the answer to the question is that yes, the things that I've outlined here are very much aligned with niche construction theory. And niche construction theory has, of course, expanded into other things beyond its initial narrow focus on population genetics to do all kinds of interesting ideas about cultural evolution and those kinds of things. But the thing that differs my approach from theirs is that I'm I'm trying to understand the physiology of this, and they were trying to understand other aspects of it. And when you talk about physiology, you cannot get away from the organism and its implications, homeostasis, and those kinds of things. And so I like to say that, all right, well, I'm the physiological dimension of niche construction, and they are other dimensions of niche construction, but we've ended up very much kind of in the same philosophical space. Now, I called my first book The Extended Organism to distinguish it from Dawkins' idea of extended phenotype. You know, the standard niche construction theory looks upon modifications of the environment as an expression of the genotype as a kind of phenotype. And I think that you can't sustain a distinction between phenotype and genotype. I think that's one of the things that breaks down when you talk about the organism. And so that's why I titled first book, the extended or organism, as opposed to the extended phenotype. And of course, this is where, issues of just what the organism is. Uh, can it be explained reduction in a reductionist framework? Is it possible to atomize the functions of the organism? And where I've been led is that no, you can't. You have to treat it as a unitary organism. You can do it scientifically. Like I said, none of what I've said here is well, almost none is indistinguishable or uh, none of it is contrary to. Well, it's basically um, coherent with elementary laws of thermodynamics and also principles of conservation of mass. There's nothing magical that comes into it until you start talking about things like the bios, which I think is one of the areas where that I think is rich for future scientific inquiry. What's the nature of that? So anyway, that's kind of the distinction between niche construction theory and what I do. Niche construction theory very much still believes in the phenotype. I don't think that's entirely sufficient.
Thank you. Yater, did you have anything you wanted to ask or say?
Maybe when you were talking about everything being living, or maybe I misinterpreted, but
Hmm.
I was thinking like I like the part about the sodium and potassium pumps, and
Hmm.
so I understand the cells are living, but are
Hmm.
you arguing or offering that the substance outside the cell, as in like the cytosol or the blood, is also living?
Yes.
Yeah, right. Can
Hmm.
you maybe elaborate on that, or give me some clarity there? I thought that was an interesting concept.
Sure. If you um, just to take that example of water balance in the cell, all right. This is tied into transport of ions across the membrane, for example. And in the case of the sodium potassium ATPase that was illustrated there, if you take potassium out of the external environment and put it inside, you're reducing the concentration of potassium on one side and increasing it on the other. And this is a consequence of the action of that sodium potassium ATPase. So if the cell was dead, for example, you would have a different distribution of potassium across that membrane. But when it's alive, then obviously things are going on inside the cell that are living. But if you look at the signature of that, which is of course the concentrations of sodium and potassium on the other side, for the presence of that living thing, you get a reduction of potassium outside, right? If you take that living thing away, you don't get I should say, if you take the living processes away, you get a different distribution of sodium. And so, yes, it does. Living things, life does impart properties of life onto the external environment as well. I got to thinking about that actually not on that small level, but actually with the work on the termite mounds. The termite mound is a very dynamic structure. There's soil cycling through it all the time, and if you think about what's going on there, that the structure of the mound and the processes that go into it are dynamic. They're regulated. They're coherent, and I've struggled to actually find a difference between the physical mound, all right, and the termites. But I can't do it. I can't draw a distinct dividing line, and this means that, gosh, that mound is as alive as the colony that builds it. Um, it's responsive, it is regulated. There's a process going on that does that, and the mound adapts to conditions, ultimately through the termites. And I've also been friends with Lynn Margulis, who, as you know, was one of the two people who've been advocating Gaia theory, for example. And I got to know James Lovelock a little bit in that. And again, if you look at his way of distinguishing, say, a living planet, Earth, from a non-living planet like Mars, all you need to do is look at the composition of the atmosphere. Our own atmosphere, for example, is far from equilibrium, right? You would not expect that kind of distribution of oxygen and CO2 and water vapor and nitrogen and those kinds of things in a non-living planet. And in fact, you find on the Martian atmosphere, it's very close to what you would expect for thermodynamic equilibrium. And that's the signature that life exists on Earth, but it doesn't necessarily exist, or at least not to any degree, on Mars, for example. And again, it's hard to escape the conclusion that the atmosphere is a biological construct. It's life imparting the signature of life to the atmosphere, and its signature is that life is actually pushed the composition of the atmosphere far from thermodynamic equilibrium. And so, those are the three things that I often say that supports the idea that yes, life imparts life to its environment.
Yater, any follow up?
Kind of was thinking after the termite reference that you need one to have the other in all circumstances, but I had trouble following the rest of it, but I do appreciate the dialogue for sure.
Was it the atmosphere that we were that
Yeah, yeah, I
where
was
I
getting
lost
that.
you?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So um, the high composition of oxygen plus a measurable concentration of methane in the atmosphere, for example, both of those are produced in large quantities by living systems. And if you shut off all life tomorrow, let's hope that doesn't happen, on the Earth, then you would find that the Earth's atmosphere would gradually go towards a more stable equilibrium state, a thermodynamically equilibrium state. So, for example, oxygen would go down to near zero. Methane concentrations would also go down. Probably nitrogen as well, because a lot of the nitrogen in the atmosphere is involved in the nitrogen metabolism of various bacteria that can fix nitrogen and so forth. So, whereas if you look at the composition of the atmosphere on Mars, it's very high in CO2, almost no oxygen, very little water vapor there. Some methane that pops out for anomalous reasons, who knows why, but it comes and goes episodically, and so the Earth has an atmosphere that is largely a biological construct, and it's a construct of organisms that are doing the same thing that cell does. It's modifying flows of matter and energy between living things in the atmosphere. The atmosphere is pushed away from thermodynamic equilibrium by the action of the living things that populate the Earth, and so that's. I don't know if I've convinced you anymore that,
Yeah.
that it makes sense, or if
It's
I've brought you
I
along.
see like being at equilibrium does not necessarily mean like life, sort of.
Well, if anything is at thermodynamic equilibrium, it's dead, right? And death in our cells, for example, is the failure of the body to do that order-producing work that is powered by the metabolic rate. When the metabolic rate stops, that order-producing work stops, and then the organism degrades back to thermodynamic equilibrium. And that's thermodynamically what death is.
Right.
But Dr. Turner, so you're drawing a parallel. Yader's initial question was, okay, we know the cell is alive. Inside the cell, living activities are going on, but is outside the cell also alive? You're saying yes, and that to reinforce the point, we can look at the the inside of the biosphere, so to speak, or the collective living entities on the surface of planet Earth, and then the outer environment or the atmosphere. In the same way, the life affects the atmosphere and it extends out to it.
Mhm.
In the same way, the cell, which is alive, its living activity extends outside of the single cell into the environment around it.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And all of that's based not on anything magical, but simple conservation of mass.
Regarding the atmosphere, I mean, isn't it made up of microbes in the atmosphere itself?
Yeah, there are microbes in the atmosphere, and they're they float around. So for example, winds, for example, will bring in spores of different organisms. For example, these can act as dispersal mechanisms for these biological entities. So yes, there are living things in there. Um, but if you look at what's actually um, uh, doing the work, well, I should say where the majority of the work being done, the metabolic work being done to actually impart life to the atmosphere, that's from green plants, not only on land, but also mostly in the ocean. Of course, green plants are one aspect of a larger cycle of matter and energy flow. If you have a green plant sitting there producing an orderly organism, that's an energy source that herbivores can come along and steal some of it, and they produce CO2. And the herbivores, of course, are consumed by other kinds of predators, that also will return CO2 to the atmosphere. Fungi are another big contributor to the cycling of matter and energy through biospheres. And so, you know, nearly all of the nearly all of the metabolic work of the Earth, for example, is from living things that are populating the surface, not so much in the atmosphere.
Alex, before we move forward with any other comments, did you want to add anything while you're here? We still have about 10 minutes in the program if you have anything you'd like to put out there.
No, I'm okay though.
Okay, okay. Well, thank you for
Okay.
coming.
All right.
So, so I'll just ask one more point. Is it okay, Dr. Turner, or do you want to turn in, or is it okay if I ask another question?
Of course, yeah. I'm here till 5 o'clock.
All right, cool. Um, so, so obviously you're encouraging us to think in terms of interconnected systems on all
Yes.
scales of life and nature in general.
Hmm.
So this is a question that, so after the conference that you attended with us 2 years ago, last year's conference, Michael Levin ended up coming and he was a speaker at that conference.
Hmm.
And so I'm working on the proceedings for that still, even though another conference is coming. So this question about within systems thinking,
Hmm.
differentiating between a collective and a whole unto itself. Because Michael Levin errs on the side of an organism is just a hive intelligence. It's just a
Mhm.
collective. And you alluded to something like that when you, unless I misinterpreted you, where you said it's, you know, it's a system of agreements, which I get is a fact. An
Mhm.
organism is made up of single cells that agree to participate in tissues and organs that make up the whole organism. And I
Right.
don't know what the inner experience of any other organism, including anyone here, is. But from my side, I have this experience of being a unitary, singular self that's no doubt intrinsically dependent on others, but still I have this singular identity that feels real. And whatever spiritual education I received from the Vedic side reinforces that, yes, that individuality is real, it's not an illusion, although it's interdependent on other individuals in a whole. That's the context. So, how can we determine between hive intelligence, collective intelligence, and a whole unto itself, which has a singular identity? How can we navigate that?
That's a very good question, and I don't have a good answer for it, to be honest with you. You know, it's um, the in termite mounds, there's very definitely a hive intelligence at work, and this has some implications for how we think, for example, about what nervous systems or brains are, or things like that. I've actually written some things about that from the perspective of termite colonies. And there's a brain there, there's an intelligence, I think, operating in the termite colony, as well as intelligence operating in the organisms it comprises, right? Um, but how you get from one to the other, we've done some work, for example, of looking at the interaction of behavior of termites with the physical environment that they are in, and also how they communicate with one another as well. And we know that that's involved somehow. So, for example, there's a rather a complex water economy that goes on inside termite colonies, and like a human economy is the accumulated nature of transactions between individual human beings of goods and services and values and value judgments and those kinds of things. We still really don't understand economics, do we? Because we're well, we're still struggling with just what economics is and what the best economic system is, and so forth. But somehow there's a kind of magic that makes it work, and the magic that's at the heart of it, I think, is this concept of wanting and striving and desiring. And I don't know what that is right now, but I'm pretty convinced that you can't explain it in a reductionist fashion. We have to expand the mind space that we're working in to be able to somehow think about desire and purpose in all of these in all of these interactions, not just in biological systems, but among ourselves and our relation with the environment and those kinds of things. So the answer I have for you is that I don't have a good answer, but I do think that we can't get there if we persist in breaking down. Well, I don't think the reductionist approach is going to lead us very far. It's led us just about as far as I think we can go. On the other hand, on the other side of it, there's a danger that, okay, well, if we take a more broad approach to it and a systems approach like Michael Levin does, that's certainly a very promising way of doing it. But that way of thinking has a tendency to fall into its own kind of magical thinking. So for example, the phrase emergent systems is a very popular one. I don't know what an emergent system is. I think there's room for looking into what an emergent system is, but I don't think you can explain any of that without incorporating, intelligence, purposefulness, desire, if you will, into those models. And the reductionist mindset won't allow that. And I think it's going to run into a dead end similarly.
To be fair from Michael Levin's work, because over the last year I had to look into it quite a bit
Hmm.
more than I anticipated,
Hmm.
and he would agree with you with skepticism about what emergent. It's just like
Yeah,
it's a cover up, and
you're
he
right.
uh,
Yeah,
and he also would attribute that cognition is fundamental.
yeah.
But
Hmm.
he, he and I'd love to send a copy of these proceedings from last year's conference to you when it's finished because I
Oh,
really
I
tried to.
would love that. Hmm.
Okay, awesome.
I would love that. Yeah.
He he takes it to the point where he says even a sorting algorithm has cognitive potencies because the typical argument is an AI. So he's all for AI robots
Hmm.
should not
Hmm.
be considered not living, which you know I don't want to be like closed-minded or anything, but I
Yeah.
can't get myself on board with that.
Yeah.
But his
Yeah.
argument is that, well, people say that it only does what the algorithm you put into it does, which is why it's not alive. And he said, well, and he wrote a whole paper about it, right? Peer review paper. Well, actually,
Hmm.
that algorithm itself, the most simple algorithm, doesn't just do what the
Hmm.
algorithm is supposed to do.
Yeah.
And so I mean, he takes it to another level, trying to eradicate. I mean, very without hiding it, he tries to eradicate the difference between life and non-life.
Hmm. Hmm.
But in ways, so maybe I'll just make this last point, ask you a question. He says that in order to, so to prove that non-life and life, life can come from non-life, well, every living entity goes from an oocyte to a thinking, breathing, living entity.
Hmm. Hmm.
And he's repeatedly said that in many videos that I've watched of him. But
Hmm.
I think that's a wild thing to say because an oocyte is an unfertilized egg.
Hmm. Hmm.
So no one goes from an oocyte to a living entity. So many oocytes are developed and then dissipate because they're
Yeah.
not fertilized.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a fertilized oocyte develops into a living entity. And if you take that route, then okay, Louis Pasteur, he was inspired by a Hegel dialectic idea that this
Hmm.
seed, the germ of life, is where that perhaps the bios comes into play, the germ of life,
Hmm.
and it's the germ of life that fertilizes the oocyte, which then gives you a thinking, breathing, developmental organism. So the
Yeah.
fact that he just says oocyte to organism seems very misleading because the oocyte doesn't develop like that. It has to be fertilized, and there's something special in that seed of life. Anyhow,
Yeah.
so I'm just kind of throwing
Well,
these thoughts at you.
yeah, uh, I think one of the things that diverts us reliably from thinking clearly about, or maybe building a scientific philosophy of purpose and desire, is is that we distinguish consciousness from cognition. We think they're related somehow, but everyone talks about consciousness, and we have no idea really what consciousness is. And I prefer actually to look focus on cognition as something that we can get a handle on scientifically, that we can actually maybe even quantify, and those kinds of things. And when we talk about it in those terms, the oocyte is as cognitive a being as an organism, as a living, breathing organism is. A living, breathing organism has obviously a very complex cognitive world, right? Somehow that results in our conscious experience of the world. But when you look at the thing that unites the oocyte or any other kind of living thing in there with any other kind of living thing, it's cognition. They're all cognitive entities. The um, every cell is a cognitive unit. Every epithelium is a cognitive unit, and so forth up the scale. And those cognitive units interpret the environment and the internal state, and then they result in some kind of work that's done to, sustain the cognitive unit at whatever scale you're talking about. So I think cognition is the nature of cognition, and the way it operates at different scales is going to be, I think, a fertile line of inquiry. Now, you mentioned algorithms and those kinds of things. This is another very interesting aspect of the way we think about cognition and intelligence, and that is that we think of, well, we're basically bringing the cybernetic metaphor for homeostasis into the way brains work, for example, right? The brain is a computer, and you can formulate programs that can learn, they can adapt, and those kinds of things, exhibit all those sorts of things. But I'm not quite so sure it's been established well that the brain is a computer. If you look at, for example, the structure of the human brain, it's organized into different, nuclei, subcortical nuclei, and there's also some complex networks of information flow within the brain that go, along different tracts, and you can certainly build a computational model of it, but then you start running into other things. So, for example, if you look at the proliferation of neurotransmitters and neurotransmitter receptors, and dopamine is the one that I happen to know a little bit about, you not only have multiple receptors out there, right, for dopamine, and depending upon what those receptors are, you can get different effects. But then you add to that, you have multiple kinds of neurotransmitters that all do the same thing. And so you have this proliferation of receptor diversity and neurotransmitter diversity that are quite contrary to the notion that the brain is a computer. It's over designed. There's a lot of redundancy built in there. And this carries all the classic signs of an evolutionary arms race, And so maybe the brain is not a computer at all. It's basically this venue for this chemical warfare that goes on continually between populations of nerve cells that have different neurotransmitters, sometimes, to do the same thing, different kinds of receptors, so that a transmitter does different things depending upon where you are. And all of that makes me skeptical of this idea that we can understand life by thinking in computational terms. And I illustrated that talking about the cybernetic metaphor of homeostasis. It ultimately breaks down when you start talking about things like organisms or superorganisms or those kinds of things. And I think the concept of the brain as a computer also tends to break down the more you get into the actual workings of it.
These are all important lines of inquiry that I think are starting to just be taken seriously at this point in
I hope so.
time.
I hope so.
Yeah, I know. So here we are, 5:07, and
Is it really that early? Oh gosh.
I wanted to just.
Wait. We're supposed to go to 5. Okay, all right.
Yeah, I know. So,
Yeah.
but I'm very much inspired by biomimicry, and I know your termite towers have inspired that Eastgate Center
Yes.
in Africa. I was wondering. I promise my last. I wonder if you had any connection with that biomimicry building.
Yes, peripherally. I wasn't involved in Mick Pierce's, who's the architect of that place, uh, design. I mean, he constructed that building prior to the time I got interested in termites. But what I and my collaborators have been finding about the operation of termite mounds has some interesting implications for building buildings that mimic what termite mounds do. And since then, I've actually developed a friendship with Mick Pierce. He's a really interesting guy. There are some aspects of the design of the Eastgate Center that aren't quite what termites actually do, but his design was inspired by what people then knew about how termite mounds worked, which oddly enough turns out to be kind of incorrect. But um, but yeah, and one of my collaborators, Rupert Soar, he's at Nottingham University. He actually has delved into some of the engineering possibilities of mimicking termite mound function for ventilation of buildings. And just to give you a short example of that, those plaster endocasts of termite mounds, they actually represent a mechanism for taking energy and turbulent wind and gradually damping down the energy, but still making some form of energy available to power gas exchange in the termite colony itself. Termites don't like gusty winds. They don't like changes over time of concentrations of CO2 or oxygen or what have you. And their lives are dedicated to building a steady environment within the nest. And yet they're using this violently fluctuating energy source in turbulent winds to be able to capture that energy to power gas exchange. Our lungs work in a similar way, by the way. But what Rupert Soar has been doing is say, well, all right, let's look at the architecture of these tunnel networks and build adaptively porous walls, all right, so that if you want to ventilate your building, you don't have to power it with ducts and motors and fans or things like that anymore. You can build a building that has walls whose porosity is organized in a particular way, and that will mean that you can get refreshment of air within a room just by sticking it out there in the wind. And of course, the way we do that right now for individual rooms is we open and close windows and vents and those kinds of things. And because of the nature of turbulent wind, that inconveniences people in certain ways, because you get gusts that blows papers off your desk and all these kind of things. But if you can build a building that has porous walls that can do the same thing that you do by opening a window, but you do it through the walls instead of through a gap in the walls at the window, you can get perfectly good exchange of air turnovers in rooms without having to build in large motors and ducts and ducting systems and those kinds of things. And that's been his major area of work. That's been one of the things that the basic question, how does this thing work as a lung, has actually had some applied implications. But just one final thing that I wanted to mention about biomimicry. Um, Biomimicry, there's a lot of promise in there, but one of the shortcomings, I think, of the biomimicry idea is that it treats uh, biomimesis as a kind of object-oriented thinking. And so, for example, if you have a termite mound with tunnel networks structured in a certain way, well, all we need to do is actually build a wall that has that same structure and it will function in the same way. And to a large extent, that's true. It probably would work that way. But if you look at biomimicry, well, if you look at the biology that biomimicry is mimicking, homeostasis is absolutely at the center of that. You can't understand the dynamic or even mimic the dynamic nature of life without accounting for homeostasis. And how do you do that in a building? In the case of the termite mounds, they're always rebuilding that mound. There's always soil being eroded, always soil being brought up, and it's being continually remodeled. And I think the big challenge for biomimicry is how do you incorporate that kind of striving, if you will, into the designs of our buildings and our systems. So that's
Yeah.
where I come down on that.
taking something dynamic and making it into
Yeah,
something static, you're bound to run into some hiccups. Yeah, something which is
absolutely.
something which is
Abs-
continually being self-renewed.
yes.
Just
Hey,
taking a
yeah,
snapshot of it. I see.
yeah, yeah. Good way of putting it. Yeah,
Huh. I never thought about that.
yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Turner, for your
It's
time
a
and your,
it's a pleasure.
yeah,
Okay.
it's been awesome, really awesome. Uh,
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm thank the audience, even though we've dwindled to one other person by now. But anyway, thank you all for everyone who came, and also to you, Yater Henry, who stuck it out to the bitter end.
yes.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll look forward to seeing the recording of this. And again, thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed this presentation and discussing it with you guys afterwards.
Thank you. We'll be in touch very soon.
Okay. All right. Good night then.
Good night.